Welcome, everyone. I think am I on the screen? Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today for this really important session, a pandemic within a pandemic, intimate partner violence. I'm Dr. Shanti Kulkarni, and I'm a faculty member at the School of Social Work here at UNC Charlotte. I also do research on the impact of trauma, violence, and abuse on marginalized peoples and communities, and in order to create policies and practices and service delivery systems that promote survivor healing. I've also been active in the movement against gender-based violence for more than 20 years, so I consider myself um, an advocate and an activist in those fields. So today I have the pleasure of moderating this panel of amazing women, and I think we're going to really have an informative, inspiring conversation. So I think I'm now going to invite the panelists to introduce themselves. So I'd like to invite Karen Parker, Ms. Karen Parker.
Good afternoon. I'm Karen Parker, and I'm the president and CEO of Safe Alliance, and that is the organization here in town that does domestic violence and sexual assault services. And I have been involved in this work for 31 years now. So have worked in North Carolina, Texas, and Georgia in a lot of different roles over the years, and love doing the work, and it's very fulfilling, and really appreciate the opportunity to be here with everyone today.
Thank you so much, Karen. Let's see, Leigh Norwood, could you introduce yourself and I guess I should say share a little bit about what you do and how you became involved with this issue?
Yes. So I'm Leigh Norwood. I'm an assistant director over at the Counseling and Psychological Services Center on campus. I've been on campus for about 8 years, but I've been in this field for about 17 years. And I got involved in this research when I was in graduate school and did some projects around domestic violence and how it has impacted college students, particularly at historically Black colleges and universities. But my main experience with that was when I worked with the police department in a partnership with area mental health called the Child Development Community Policing Program. And so I am happy to be here, and it's just interesting how, domestic violence and IPV just kind of transcends and touches all aspects of our lives. And so working with college students now in that role has really added to that experience that I've had. So good to be here.
Okay. Thank you, Leigh. And I want to, last but not least, invite Midori Davidson and to share her experience. And one of the things in our movement is we feel like we want to center everything we do on survivors and survivors' experiences and stories. And so we're very fortunate to have Midori here, who is representing herself as a survivor as well as an advocate. So Midori, would you like to introduce yourself and share a little bit of your story?
Sure, absolutely. Good afternoon, everyone. And hey, Karen. I am a survivor of domestic violence. For me, it has been 16 years. My, how time flies. But to be able to sit here in this seat and say that I made it out is indeed a blessing, as I have witnessed many who have not. My story began shortly after I graduated college. I landed my first job at Wells Fargo. On my way home from work, I meet this very charismatic young minister. Thought he was very charming. Little did I know he was the devil in sheep's clothing. What started out as a casual friendship turned very volatile. He had bipolar disorder, as well as he was an alcoholic, and he masked the two very well. And when looking back in retrospect, you can always point the finger and say, hey, he was this, he was that. But in my ownership, which was part of my healing, was finding the parts that I could own. The thing that I own about the relationship was that I normalized it. I grew up with violence in my home. I grew up around it in my neighborhood. To hear the B word, it was an adjective. To meet my uncle's girlfriends with healing black eyes and they're wearing these Donna Summer disco shades, that was the norm for me. So dealing with my ex-fiance, because in the midst of all of this, he proposed and said he was going to get counseling and he was going to work on himself. All of this was normal because I saw it growing up. So being able, and of course, it got worse. I survived strangulation. He held me up at gunpoint and at knife point. He broke into my apartment on a few occasions to steal my car. Money was stolen, so I had to get very creative in how to hide money. That was indeed a crash course in financial literacy for me, because prior to dealing with him, I never had to worry about looking at a bank statement or having to know how much money I brought in. I was checking statements like clockwork. I was calling the bank so much they knew me on a first name basis. Being able to try to protect myself even at work. I had to let security guards know if anyone came through looking for me, please do not tell them I'm here. Notify the police. I had to do that in a manner that was discreet, because keeping in mind, this is corporate America, this is 2005. Domestic violence wasn't exactly a topic of discussion. Safe Alliance wasn't here then. There was a safe house on Billingsley Road that was quite open. It looked like a regular home. So I didn't even feel safe to go there. In order for me to escape my relationship, I took the money that I had hidden around my house, from the freezer, the laundry detergent bottles, to shampoo and conditioner bottles, and file cabinets and various envelopes that I had to stash. And I even had to hide my Bible where I had money there. And I just scrambled to all these places, gathered as much of my things as I could, and I just escaped. I kept driving north, so I drove all the way to Michigan. Little did I know that while I was gone, he found where an address of a card that my grandmother sent, and he knew the address of where I was in Michigan. And somehow he got there. And so he stalked me. He stalked me there. And it was an absolute nightmare in dealing with law enforcement and protection, and having to get my employer, who I miss my manager to this day. She was awesome, and being proactive and notifying the local authorities. Even the county in where I lived in Michigan, the first year, Cass County, they were on top of it. But it was still a nightmare trying to end this cycle of stalking and abuse and manipulations. So finally, enough was enough Christmas Eve, when my family got involved. And I can sit back now and laugh because it looked like a scene off of Medea's Family Reunion. But at the time, it was very intense, very dramatic, very raw. And I wound up having to call the police, because he did steal my car and tried to drive off to the next state, which was Indiana. And luckily, the police, and by the grace of God, I remembered my license plate. They caught him in mid-route and he was arrested. I never got to have my day in court, however, because another woman bailed him out of jail. So because of the warnings, I guess, the final warning signals that he received from my family, he finally left me alone. But it took all of that, as well as the use of multiple resources, just to get him off my back. it was a nightmare that finally ended and I was finally able to breathe. But in going through that, I realized at that time the very lack of resources that women had, that even that victims had, period. There were little to none. There were no agencies that advocated for victims unless you contacted United Way. And then United Way had a hotline where they could disperse your information to different agencies. But there was no one that you could go to in your local community and say, hey, I need help. I'm glad to see organizations such as Safe Alliance that are planted in the heart of the community where survivors can go. I'm happy to see that the discussion around domestic violence is really picking up, because even before the situation happened to me, I think about Sharika Sanders and her murder with Ray Caruth. And I was working at CMC Hospital when that baby was brought in and placed in NICU. And we all went down to pray, and just seeing the tubes and her fight for life over an issue that she had no control over. You know, it just feels to me that the work still needs to be done. The conversations still need to be had. And as a Black woman growing up in a predominantly African American community, we need to understand what we normalize. And we need to learn how to say, that's not okay. We can't stuff it and make it cute anymore, because it's not.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Midori. I'm really glad that you're doing okay, and it seems like thriving right now. But there's so much in your story that I think illustrates some things that people maybe don't expect and don't know. And I just wanted to highlight a few. Like, just one is just how it can start so slow, right?
Oh, yeah.
And it
It
builds
starts
from
off
there.
really slow, and then it stacks up and stacks up and stacks up.
Mhm.
And, you know, it's so interesting that we bring up the college environment, because in college is where it started to become real, in the sense that I went to school, I went to class with women who were raped later on that quarter. And I can remember them reporting it to the school administration, and it was swept under the rug. It wasn't until I got an internship with the local TV affiliate, an NBC affiliate called KSBY, and I brought it to the attention of a young Asian reporter. And I took her on campus to show her where my classmates were raped. And all of a sudden, I was a troublemaker for speaking up. There was even an issue with lighting. We did not have enough lighting. We protested. We did a Take Back the Night session of sorts. And even Dr. Angela Davis came down and spoke about the importance of just rallying together and starting to speak out, even with the littlest of things. We can't normalize what is not normal. And the fact that you have a campus that's wide open, no lighting, no good. And we protested about that. And little do you know, 2 years later, a girl was abducted from that very campus. Um, and no one knew what happened to her. So it does start off slow, and then it builds and it builds and it builds. And you have to decide, when is the pot too hot for me? And if you don't know your limits, if you don't know when it's not okay, then it could be too late.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Um, I want to shift a little bit to kind of take a step back and help people think who might be newer to this issue. What what IPV, or we call it intimate partner violence. Sometimes it's called domestic violence. How we define that term. So I'm wondering, Karen, if you could maybe talk a little bit about how you define IPV, and what are some things that people who are outside the field might be surprised to know?
Well, I think when you're defining it, a lot of times people go straight to the place of bruises and physical violence, but it's really all about power and control. And that's something we try to teach people, that it's the controlling action, it's the the boyfriend who is monitoring your phone calls all the time or telling you where to go, who to see, trying to isolate you from your friends and family. Maybe a partner who is showing up at your workplace a lot, monitoring your activities. And there may be many, many things that happen before it becomes physical. And I think a lot of people don't know that. They just picture it as the punches and the bruises and those kinds of things. So there's a lot that tends to happen before it actually becomes physical. And by the time it has become physical, a lot of times the victim is so intertwined, their lives are so intertwined that it's really, really difficult to get out. So we always try to tell people you should never say to a victim, why don't you just leave? Because usually at that point, they are so entangled in the relationship and the perpetrator has so much control over them in so many different ways that it can be very dangerous to try and leave the relationship, because that's when the offender is actually going to lose control of the victim. And that's when they tend to get very violent. And so it's really important that if you are in that type of situation, that you reach out and that you're working with an organization or someone who can help you with safety planning, because it has to be a very deliberate, intentional, and safe process. And so that's really what domestic violence organizations are here to do. It's not to make people leave, but it's to meet you where you are and do safety planning, whether you're planning to stay with the offender or if you're planning to leave them, or maybe you've already left and they're stalking you. And so those are the things that we tend to help with in our program.
Yeah, Leigh, do you want to add some?
I was going to say, I think the same holds true in terms of how we experience that and how it's seen here on the college campus. I do feel as one thing that is very evident is the way that coercion plays into that, in terms of like women can, find themselves in situations in which there's this slow progression of like, well, this is expected, this is expected, this is expected in relationships. And developmentally, a lot of our young students believe that they should come to college and find their mate, right? This is the expectation that society has created. And so what generally happens is there's this norm of like, well, this is expected in relationships. And then that slow pattern of coercion begins. And it can just manifest until it does become a pattern of just like abusive like relationship, as Karen and Midori have already alluded to.
Yeah, I think what one thing here and what you're all saying is how confusing it is for the person who's actually in that relationship about, because on one hand, it's been really normalized by the culture. And on the other hand, it's being really normalized by the person who's hurting you, being told that that's normal. We had a question come in on the chat about verbal abuse. And I think that's a big part of what you're talking about. Can you talk about how it's possible to identify that, especially for maybe students or young people who are newer to relationships, how you kind of distinguish between, what's maybe normal fighting versus what is maybe more psychological or verbal abuse?
Yes, the ways that we think about it from our standpoint in the counseling center is like those things that are said to kind of derogatory statements, and those things that can automatically cause like that self-doubt and contribute to low self-worth. We have a group called Building Better Relationships, and while that's a group that it's open to everyone, the real purpose of the group is to be able to kind of like highlight what are some healthy patterns, what are some healthy relationship strategies, what are signs and symptoms, because sometimes, and red flags rather, kind of what Midori was talking about a little bit earlier, because sometimes like those verbal assaults can start off very small and then they get to be larger and impact and have such a significant impact on someone's self-worth.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Midori, I wonder if you can comment on, some of the language we're using, that we tend to use the word survivor. Sometimes we use the word victim. Like, can you talk a little bit about why those labels matter?
Absolutely. The reason why, for me, the word survivor matters is because it sheds light on what I came out of. It also is a mindset because I don't want to feel victimized anymore. So, this means I'm embarking on a healing journey that will allow me to not only continue to learn about what happened to me, but how can I make sure that my safety, my person, and even someone else does not have to go through. Everyone's healing journey is a little different. I know for me, I started therapy and it was gradual. You know, at first I wanted to go to a therapist just to learn about what happened to me because, again, growing up in a community where you saw violence was normal. So why was this so abnormal to me? So I had to learn or relearn in some cases what was not okay. What were signs that I ignored and why did I normalize those? And then from there, I noticed, even in the workplace, where I began to have moments of rage. So, where is this rage coming from, right? Why am I so angry all the time? So then I began seeing an EDMR therapist. And EDMR, for those that don't know, is eye desensitization movement in terms of its rapidness. And what it does is that it helps the therapist pinpoint where the trauma was for you. So a lot of flashbacks occurred for me, but those flashbacks allowed me to take a deeper look within to learn about myself and how I normalized such behaviors that allowed me to be in the position that I was in as a victim. So this is where victim and survivor began to look different because being a victim means that you're caught in this volatile situation and you're not sure how you're going to find your way out. You don't know. With being a survivor, I made it through. So, how can I continue this path of healing and enlightenment so that I can ensure that it doesn't happen to me or anyone else? How can I be a part of making sure that our communities are safe? What can I do to make sure that our young girls are safe and that they understand boundaries and that they understand that it's okay to say no and follow through with that?
That's great. We had another question come through the chat, which is actually something I was going to ask you guys a little bit about as well. So, what does a healing journey look like, and kind of what supports do IPV survivors need to be safe and to heal from abusive experiences?
So finding a support group was crucial for me. And it took time. It took time for me to find a tribe of women who understood what it was that I went through. And it was about 3 years ago, I went to a sister survivor retreat out in Colorado Springs. And it was amazing. I want to say there was over 200 women. We were all survivors of domestic violence, but we were in a room being able to share our experiences and share how as advocates what we could do, exploring ideas, exploring past hurts, and we were able to do this together as a group. We still keep in touch to this day. We have a private Facebook page where we'll share any and everything that's going on in our lives and in our families. And being able to have that kind of tribe was so monumental in my healing for me because, as Karen was stating earlier, women or people who have not been through what you've been through, you have to understand what will trigger you when they ask questions such as, why didn't you just leave? Or you're a straight shooter. How did you get involved in that? that for me will automatically spark a reaction that will not be friendly for either you or me. So I had to make sure that I had a tribe of women who understood. And that was crucial in my breakthrough.
Great. And as we were talking, a question came in about for Karen around Safe Alliance and the type of trauma healings and trauma class. I think Midori has mentioned that that was very helpful in her healing, and I know that's true for other survivors. Can you talk a little bit about what Safe Alliance offers and to what populations those services are offered?
Sure, sure. We offer a range of services. Our goal is to provide everything possible that a victim survivor could need when they're going through this process. And so the way that most people enter our services is through our hotline, and that's called the Greater Charlotte Hope Line. And it provides assistance for people dealing with domestic violence, sexual assault, and parenting issues, because we know that a lot of the time when there's domestic violence going on in the home, there are also children in the home. And that's been a big issue, especially during this past year, during the pandemic. And so we offer that service. We offer shelter. We have legal services, so we help people get protective orders here in Mecklenburg County. We also provide trauma counseling through a partnership with Mecklenburg County. And a lot of what we do also is basic needs, honestly, especially when people come to our shelter. They may come with nothing. So we make sure that they have the basics, the food, the clothing, and all those things that they may need. We also do a lot of work with children, because we know that when children have seen these patterns, that the way that you can break the pattern is by them seeing what healthy relationships look like. And so it's really, really important that you do something with the children when they're coming out of these situations, so that they can see a different way. So we provide all of those things. And we also do work out in the community. And a lot of the work we're doing now is around trying to make our services more accessible, especially to communities of color and communities who may not feel safe in working in a lot of the institutions that are in the community. So we're always looking for ways to reach out more and make sure that our services feel really welcoming and specific to the people who need them.
Great. One thing that has come up through the chat is around what for friends or for family members or people that, maybe coworkers, somebody, if you know somebody who is involved in a relationship that you think might be abusive or is being hurt in that way, that's a difficult situation to do and difficult to navigate, how you bring up the issue, how you relay care, like how you have those sorts of conversation. And so I guess the question is around like, what kind of advice do each of you have for friends, family members, coworkers who might want to support survivors or victims?
Do you want me to jump in? I can continue a little bit while I'm still unmuted.
I know. Yes, you would please, Karen. That would be great.
Yeah. Well, I will tell a story. I know there are a lot of different answers to that question, but I'll tell you a story that was really just heartwarming to me. I was sitting in a restaurant one day, and doing this kind of work and having done it for so long, you will be out in the community and you will run into people who are dealing with domestic violence. And sometimes you're able to say something to them and give them information or something. There are different ways that you would approach it. And so I was sitting by myself working, and there was a table of women beside me. And they started talking to one of the women about violence that was going on in her home. And it was, of course, my radar went up, and I started listening, and I was thinking, okay, I'm going to follow one of them to the bathroom. I'm going to give them the Safe Alliance card so they can call the hotline, And as I listened, though, it was amazing because this group of women supported her completely. And they knew, I think they had probably talked before they came to lunch, because they all knew the resources. They talked about Safe Alliance. They said, if you need to get a protective order, you can go to court, and we'll go with you. We'll show up there in the courtroom with you. And you might need something for your children. And I sat there listening to them. I thought, wow, they don't need me here, which is great. That's what we're all working for, is a time when we're not needed anymore. But they all supported this person completely. And they said, whatever you need. And they expressed concern for her safety. And I just thought it was the most wonderful, just being able to sit back and watch it and see these women support one another. I think that's the ideal. Now, a lot of times you're going to be talking to someone one-on-one, and it's about expressing your concern and not telling them they should leave, not telling them what to do, because when you do that, you're doing the same thing that the perpetrator is doing. You're trying to control them. So it's really important to ask questions and offer support, but not try to take over that decision-making role, because it's not yours to take. So that's what I would say.
That's great.
Yeah, to add to that, and that was perfect, Karen, because that was exactly what I was going to say, making sure that you have a support system of women and even men who are positive and unafraid, to be comfortable in their skin, to not only share opinions with you, but offer insight by not taking over the conversation, but more like listening and asking questions as a means to guide you towards you making that decision, because that was part of my healing journey as well. Having friends, and it doesn't take a lot, but just having those small support system that I was able to say, hey, this happened, this doesn't seem normal, but my judgment is a bit off, and starting to feel comfortable even with my vulnerability and coming to you and asking a question, and you being able to listen and no judgment, you're just listening and you're able to offer insight where I may have dropped the ball. And that is crucial, so crucial. And not only in your healing journey, but in terms of getting out, knowing your resources, knowing where to go in the community. And there are even national resources. There's RAIN, for instance. If you don't know of a local hotline, you can even call RAIN and they'll talk with you. I've referred someone there before. So just knowing your go-tos and not being afraid to speak about them.
And Leigh, did you have anything you wanted to add in terms of, just for college age women?
Yeah, and I think I really wanted to go back to something Midori was saying around that healing journey and how that can look differently based on culture. When I think about that, I am really struck by how there's such an intersection between what being a survivor looks like and how that ties into what your resilience is and how you were brought up and how that ties to culture. There's such a, that's such a layered discussion, I think. And I think it's just a fascinating thing. And so when we are talking with individuals that have been impacted by domestic violence, whether it's students or whether it's faculty and staff who've just reached out for consultation, we're always trying to keep in contact that person-centered, piece, because not everyone will heal the same. And I know that there are what we call evidence-based practices, to treat, trauma, but at the same time, you must take into account a person's background, their different aspects of resilience as well.
Yeah, I love everything that you guys have said. And I think it just really highlights, my work with survivors, the feelings of shame and of isolations are so profound. And just having somebody reach out and express caring and express that they see you, even if the reaction might not be positive right away, it means something. It means something to have people notice and see and to reach out and share concerns. We have a couple of other questions, but I think I do want to make sure that we touch on some issues around the pandemic, and then I'm going to come back to those. So particularly around the pandemic, what have you all seen in terms of the need for help? And how has it, I guess, particularly for Karen and Leigh, how has it affected your ability to respond as helpers?
Well, we at Safe Alliance, the week before the stay-at-home order went into effect almost a year ago, we saw our calls go up by 45%. So there were a lot of victim survivors who were wanting to figure out where they could be and where they could stay safely during the pandemic. Throughout the course of the year, the rate of the calls has been up by about 15% the whole year compared to last year. So that was one piece, is that we're seeing a higher demand for services. With the pandemic, most shelters had to practice social distancing. And in our shelter, that meant that in our 120 bed shelter, we had to move about 23 families into a hotel to be able to maintain social distancing. So rather than operating one residential facility, since that point, we've been operating 2 residential facilities. And so that has looked very different this year. The domestic violence court has stayed open throughout the whole pandemic, but we have not been allowed to accompany victims to court, which has been very difficult because a lot of times victims really do need that person there beside them. We've been able to offer some advocacy in our offices before they go to court, and then also some virtual advocacy, but that's definitely been a difficult piece. The hospitals have not allowed us to accompany victims into a hospital, especially on the sexual assault side of things. And again, that's, it's not our best practice, but we've really done the best that we can throughout the pandemic. We've been able to pivot a lot of our services where we can offer virtual options like advocacy, like counseling. But again, one of the things we've seen throughout the year, and we've said over and over, is that when we can be back to in person, we will do in person, because it's really not the most trauma-informed practice to be doing things virtually. And so we're really excited about the vaccines and everything that's happening right now, because we're getting more people who are starting to come back into our offices.
Great. And Leigh, do you want to share a little bit about what it's looked like through the counseling center and your work with this issue?
Mm-hmm. Very similarly, we have been out of the office for almost a year now. And so what that means is that we've just been doing remote work and just really being heavily dependent on our campus partners, like the Title IX office or the Student Assistance and Support Services office or Housing and Res Life. Those offices that do have a lot more direct contact with students that may kind of hear about, sexual trauma or domestic violence, and they can kind of tap us in and see if they need services. One of the things that I think has shifted quite a bit for us is when we do have counseling services remotely. Oftentimes we might be talking with the student in their car, or we might be talking with them outside when they're outside of work because they don't feel comfortable talking in their home or near their partner. And so that's a little bit of the shift because they don't have that safety of our space that we normally have our sessions in.
Thank you. And I think we have to acknowledge that while the pandemic's been going on, we've also been facing a kind of reckoning on race. And so that has had a real impact on Black survivors in particular, and survivors of color. And so I'm wondering if you guys can talk about that. What have you seen? I think especially around domestic violence as a criminal event, or criminal justice involvement that sometimes is involved with that has special meaning for Black survivors as well. So I don't know if you'd like to share some of your thoughts on that.
I could jump in.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
With Black survivors in particular, for me, it hits home for a couple of reasons. With the recent murder of Breonna Taylor, she was related to my oldest niece. That was her cousin on her father's side. So seeing her as a little girl with my niece, to hearing about her murder, and then seeing on TV in the court system that a wall had more jurisdiction than her life. It just, for me, resonates the systemic racism that has already been in place when it comes to women of color, Black women particularly, because I think the late Zora Neale Hurston said it best, and their eyes are watching God. Black women are seen as the mules of the world. We're not seen as human. So when you have a hard time identifying with a human being, you don't value their life. And that has been the case with Black survivors since, my goodness, I mean, we can take this all the way back to slavery, really, because we were not viewed as people. We were property, and we were never included in the judicial system of things. So fast forwarding to today and seeing what happened to her, it still raises the old questions about race, about livelihood, and how the two play a part in this life. You know, do you value me enough to value my life? I look at the statistics for Black survivors, and Black women have the highest cases of intimate partner violence, domestic violence. More than 56% of Black survivors were murdered. And I look at this as well in my own life, not only with Brianna, but my mother. My mother disappeared 35 years ago. Her case was never reported to the Missing Persons Bureau. We don't know if she's alive or dead today, but what we do know is that she was in a volatile relationship with a man who we learned was a drug dealer. But her case never got reported. It was written on a piece of paper and the officer walked off. So there's political jurisdictions when it comes to this. And it's so sad that it's still that it still exists, because now we're having to once again put the need of our protection to the side to fight systemic racism.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I just wanted to add to that, I wonder how many women of color in underrepresented communities are not reporting just because of the fear that if I do report, what's the likelihood that this person might end up shot or killed, or, this, turn into a much, the situation just be exacerbated. And so I really do wonder how much this is underreported.
Yeah, I've definitely heard the same thing from survivors, is that, if my desire is to be safe, but I'm concerned if I file a police report that could result in harm to the father of my children. That's a really hard dilemma. And it's not exactly the same dilemma that white survivors face, even though they also have many struggles. It is different. Karen, I don't know if you had, I think earlier you had a comment.
Yeah, I had a little different perspective, just looking at the staff who work in the domestic violence programs. If you look at the people we serve as well as our staff, we have about 65% people of color. And so, and Black women make up about 50% of our staff. And when, several years ago, actually, Dr. Kulkarni helped us with this, did a study looking at institutional racism and looking at it specifically in our domestic violence center setting. And I think this was around 2013, maybe 14. And she uncovered a lot. And it was really important because we knew we needed to look internally at what we were doing, so we could support survivors, but also support our workforce. And so in 2016, we got really engaged in racial equity work. And we did a lot of training over the course of about 2 years, where we require every single one of our staff to go through 2 days of racial equity training with Race Matters for Juvenile Justice. And we've done a lot of other internal training here. Then we also created an equity, diversity, inclusion team, and we became a community partner with RMJJ, started doing practice change work. And that's been happening since 2016. So then you come to spring 2020, George Floyd is killed. One of the first things that happened was our Black leaders came to me and said, we really need something specific for Black women in the organization, because we're having issues processing all this, which, was very, very understandable. I think if we had not laid all that groundwork, that they may not have felt safe coming to me. That's kind of my point, is to that it's really, really important to be doing all of this work so that you can create those safe spaces. So when they did come to us, to me, we were able to develop processing groups for people of color in our organization. Justin Perry, who's a local counselor and activist, has come in and run those for us for the past year, and will continue doing it next year because that's something that they want to continue. Our white affinity group was also doing a lot of work last year because of course this affected them too, and they're trying to figure out, how do I help, what can I do to change things, and there was just so much attention to the issue. So we've been able to do a lot over the past year, but I think it's so important because we're serving victims, and we're serving the Black victims in the community and the people of color. And if our own staff don't feel comfortable even coming to work, or don't feel safe coming to work, and they're worried about their children, their sons who are out, and worried about the police and everything, then it's hard for them to help other people. So as a workforce issue, it's also really, really important to be addressing that. And I think we've had lots of opportunities, unfortunately, lots of opportunities to do that this year, but I feel like we're getting stronger and we're making a lot of positive change. Still a long way to go, but it really is important.
Yeah, that's inspiring. Thanks for sharing that. I'm glad to hear the updates. Yeah. I mean, I think it is really true in a sense that, many of these helping systems are really developed around helping white women. And there are a lot of assumptions about what women need that might not translate. Some are universal, but some might not be culturally specific. And so I think it's a real credit to our movement that we're willing to look at that and willing to, evolve what we're doing and change what we're doing and be responsive to like all survivors, but really to center the experience of Black survivors and Indigenous survivors and other survivors of color. We did have a couple of questions, and then where I'd like to end is talking about sort of resources and what people can do to get engaged around prevention, around helping, and all of that. But I did notice there were some specific questions that came up about women in the military and their experiences, and also around reaching out to the faith community. So I guess maybe does anyone want to respond to the military question or have any kind of expertise around that area? I think what we know in general is the rates for within the military are higher than the general population. And the military, I know, does have some sort of specific they have specific programs that are specific to the units. Some of the problems around that are often, though, that, if you report, it can trigger all kinds of things for a family. And there can be real unintended consequences for the partner of the military member who is accused of domestic violence that make it hard and make it a difficult choice. I don't know if other people want to chime in about that particular population.
Absolutely. I also am a board member with a national advocacy organization for domestic violence called Breaking the Silence Against Domestic Violence. And we just so happen to have on our board a counselor who was a counselor with the military. And Dr. Kulkarni, you hit it spot on. There's specific language and jargon for the military that isn't quite the same as civilians. So the processes for reporting and the outcomes are not only more intense, but it's quite different overall than what we go through. And the rates are higher because it is more intrinsic, if that makes sense. It's like looking at depression with legs, because depression by definition is anger turned inward. And when you look at the situation with the military, that's exactly what it is. And the way officers are protected for their crimes against women is very intrinsic as well. I've had a couple of aunts who served, and some of the stories they've shared with me are horrific. And how they had to overcome was even that more intense.
Thank you for sharing that. I don't know, Karen or Leigh or Midori, if you want to comment about how the faith community, I know Safe Alliance has done some work on engaging the faith community in the response to domestic violence. So Karen, I don't know if you might want to field that.
Yeah, we do a lot of training in the faith community. I think that's something we've done for a long time. We also have in town a domestic violence advocacy council, and they have a faith committee. And so I think that's a really great place to engage if that's something that you're wanting to do. One of the things we're working on in the community is building or utilizing a family justice center model, and it's going to be called the Umbrella Center. And we're involving the faith community in that too, because we know that's such an important piece, such an important support for a victim when you're trying to build a comprehensive response. And so yes, it's very, very important.
Okay. Any other thoughts about the faith community?
One thing I've noticed, because I'm also a member of the Mecklenburg County Domestic Violence Speakers Bureau, is that we get a lot of requests from the faith-based community for speakers to come and either do a table or do a short panel or discussion around domestic violence. I know personally, University Park Baptist Church has been on the forefront of engaging the community in domestic violence, having a domestic violence run in May, having panels and tables with tons of information. So I know the faith-based community has been reaching out to us for help as well.
Great, thank you for that. Yeah, and I think you guys, it's a good question, and your responses really illustrate how important it is for faith community to be involved, because often that's a place where people go for help, and often because scripture can be used in different ways, and we talk, in ways that either are supportive to survivors or in ways that are, well, you should stay because marriage is an institution. And so it's really important that the faith community has a helpful response to survivors, and really that we're in a relationship and conversation with them about their role to support survivors. So I think we have about 7 minutes left. So now might be a good time to talk about the different kinds of resources that are available. Oh, we have one more question. Let's do this real quick. What kind of, and this does relate to sort of, it's more of a prevention question. So what kind of conversations are happening with men as far as teaching them about abuse and about changing some of those behaviors? I wonder, Leigh, if you might,
Yeah.
Leigh, would you want to field this? I don't know if you, the counseling center works with women and men, so I don't know.
Yes. Well, I was going to say, one of the things that I know that the university does, just in general, is the Title IX office does do specific conversations particularly with student athletes. And so that's a very intentional task and endeavor that they're doing in terms of like really targeting like males in those particular groups, and as well as the female athletes. We do have, as far as the counseling center, we do have some men's groups. We have a Understanding Self and Others groups, which is specific to men. And those conversations can come up organically. They're not like specific to like conversations around like relationships or domestic violence and what it means to be like have healthy boundaries and things like that. But they certainly have come up before within the context of that.
Wonderful. And then just to add about that, one of the things I know we're doing on campus, but also we see in the communities more, are these bystander approaches, which are really focused on changing norms about the acceptability of violence and about norms about healthy relationships. And these are really exciting because I think they can be aimed to younger kids, school-age children, older children, high school children, and college-age children. But it's really about having accountability, right? Like for the kinds of languages that we use, the kind of expectations, and being able to create an environment that's supportive of healthy relationships. So I think those are some really exciting things that are happening in the field.
I know and I'll say this really quick, through Safe Alliance, there is an organization called Men for Change, and they are just amazing. Every year they do a walk called Walk a Mile in Her Shoes, where you see about 150 to 200 men walk in heels to symbolize the pain of domestic violence on women. And the conversations that I've had with them when they say to me, my mother was a victim, or my mother died because of domestic violence. I lost my sister, my aunt, my grandmother to domestic violence. They really get creative when they do these walks. One year I participated, we had Wonder Woman. We had a husband and wife dress up together in matching dresses and heels and wigs to walk together. And it's just amazing to see their impact on the fundraising that they've done through this walk. And it's called Walk a Mile in Her Shoes.
Yeah, thanks for putting that out. So it's important to know that like activism can be fun too, right? And joyful, like even though we're dealing with a topic that is really difficult, like what we're hoping for is like a world that is free of violence. And so we do a lot of celebration as we're also trying to raise awareness. So with just a few minutes left, I wonder, Karen and Leigh, especially, maybe you can start talking about the different resources or how people can get involved, and perhaps, the women, we could have it sent out some kind of list or something if that's something people would appreciate.
Okay, yeah. Well, with Safe Alliance, Midori's already done part of my work here for me. So she's talked about Men for Change and Walk a Mile in Her Shoes. Walk a Mile is May 15th this year, and it's a virtual event, and you can walk and raise funds. And that's a great way just to lightly get involved if it's something you're just trying to start learning a little bit more about and do something kind of fun. We also want to make sure people always know about our hotline. We try to get the word out about the hotline and just educate the community so that if you are in a situation where someone is in need of a resource, that that's a great thing to get them to. I mentioned earlier the Family Justice Center that we're working to create. That has been a long effort. We're about 3 years in. We've created what is called the Survivor Resource Center, and that is kind of a precursor to a Family Justice Center. It just opened this past month, and we are providing wraparound services to victims who are in the most danger in the community. So the really highest risk victims, and by that I mean people where there are weapons in their home, where there has been strangulation, as Midori mentioned earlier. That's a big red flag that it's a really dangerous situation. So we've opened this center where we are specifically serving these folks. But our big goal is that we're running a capital campaign to be able to build a full center where we can have comprehensive services for everyone. And that's an effort that we definitely need help in. And there is a charmecfamilyjusticecenter.org website. And if you're interested, you can learn more about it there. We're currently working to secure funding from different sources. We're going to city council right now. So if it's something that's important to you, we'd love for you to reach out to your city council representative and let them know it's important to you.
Yes, and I can certainly include mine on the information that we send out. But again, we have a sexual trauma group, we have the women's empowerment group that are culturally specific, but then we also have general therapy groups too within the counseling center. The Center for Wellness Promotion actually has someone that provides a lot of psychoeducation around intimate partner violence. And I think that she does a phenomenal job at that, doing that across campus in various classes, as well as, again, I mentioned Title IX. And a lot of the times, there are a lot of different perspectives around Title IX in terms of like how, some campuses, I do believe, have this push to like make victims actually report, even if they don't feel comfortable. Our office does not do that. They really do like strive to like get supports and services for the student. So whether that means like trying to get them into another section of a class, you know, if the student doesn't feel comfortable in that class that her stalker's in, you know, so even like, you know, practical things like that that can be done without having to report is, you know, something that I really do want to strongly, you know, put out there. And also, you know, just working with like Office of Disability Services at times, because we also understand that there can be a lot of re-traumatization in some of the classes too, when you're a victim and then, you know, perhaps in a classroom that's being forced to like watch a video and write a paper on something very traumatic. What does that mean about your experience and how you take care of yourself? And so, you know, different accommodations through the Office of Disability Services could potentially help as well. So, but I can include all of those.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I got a chat from Taylor that she'll pull all that together and get that out to you. So I just we're at time, but I just want to thank Karen, Leigh, and Midori so much for spending this time with me today, and for all of you for coming. It's been a great conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.